You know, it's amazing how fast things can change in the world of global economics.
It really is.
And today we're looking at a development that could have some really big consequences. President Trump just announced a whole new set of tariffs,
Yeah.
and the reaction from around the world, well, let's just say it's been a mix of everything. He called it Liberation Day, which definitely gets your
It
attention.
certainly does.
So what's got people so worked up?
Well, I think the first thing is just how big these tariffs are.
Yeah.
He's putting a 10% tariff on almost all the goods coming into the U.S. right off the bat.
Oh,
Then he's got these extra tariffs, what he's calling reciprocal tariffs, on something like 60 different countries. Basically, countries he thinks aren't playing fair when it comes to trade. Oh, and then there's a 25% tariff just on cars made outside the U.S. It's a whole bunch of stuff happening all at once.
so today we're going to really try to understand all this. What do these tariffs mean? What could happen because of them, both here and in other countries? And we want to get a sense of all the different perspectives on this. We want to give you the knowledge, help you really grasp what's going on, but without getting too lost in all the complicated econ talk.
Exactly.
So where should we start?
Well, let's start with what Trump actually announced, the details of it all.
Okay, good idea.
So, yeah, like you said, there's that 10% tariff on pretty much everything coming into the U.S., and that starts this Saturday.
This Saturday. So soon.
Yep, fast, right. Then next Wednesday, those reciprocal tariffs kick in. Like I said, that's for about 60 countries. The basic idea there is the U.S. will set tariffs at about half the rate those countries are charging on stuff we send them.
I see.
And then tonight at midnight Eastern time, the 25% tariff on all foreign cars starts.
It's a lot to keep track of. So what's the main argument here? Why are they doing this, putting up all these trade barriers?
Well, the White House is saying this is all about making America's economy strong again. They say it's about fighting back against unfair trade practices, stuff that's been going on for decades.
Right.
Trump's been pretty strong in how he's talking about it, saying that other countries have taken advantage of the U.S. for too long and that this is like a declaration of economic independence.
I did hear some of those speeches. Pretty intense stuff.
Oh, yeah. He's not holding back. And his main points are other countries should have to pay if they want to sell their stuff in the U.S., which is a huge market, obviously.
Makes sense.
That these tariffs will protect the U.S. from being hurt by unfair trade practices, and that it'll all lead to more growth here at home.
He also talked about specific tariffs other countries have, right?
He did, yeah. He brought up Brazil's 10% tariff, Bangladesh at 74%, Pakistan's at 58%, and then Sri Lanka's, which is a whopping 88%.
Oh, that's high.
Yeah, and by pointing those out, the administration is trying to show what they see as the problem, you know? Like, look how high these tariffs already are that American companies have to deal with, and they're trying to say that the U.S. is just responding in kind.
Right, right. But those countries are pretty different from the U.S., aren't they? I mean, their economies are different, and the stuff they trade with the U.S. is different, too.
That's true. It's always a little tricky to compare these things directly.
Yeah, it's complicated.
Yeah.
Now, what about the dairy stuff with Canada and Mexico? What was that all about?
Yes. Trump specifically mentioned Canada's dairy tariffs, saying they're between 250% and 300%. And, it's true that Canada does have really high tariffs on dairy imports.
They do.
Yeah, but it only kicks in once you go over a certain amount that you're allowed to import without those high tariffs. It's part of their system for managing their dairy supply.
Okay.
He also said that the U.S. is basically subsidizing Canada and Mexico by hundreds of billions of dollars every year. And, well, the USMCA, the trade deal between the three countries, does have some stuff about agricultural trade, but whether it's really like giving them direct subsidies of that much money, that's up for debate.
So it sounds like the administration's really focused on what they see as protectionist policies from our biggest trading partners.
That's definitely a key takeaway.
Now, there's this whole idea of kind reciprocal tariffs.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. is charging half of what the other country charges. What's the strategy there?
Well, the idea is to be a little less aggressive than just straight up matching the other country's tariff. The administration's thinking is by charging half, they're giving that country a reason to lower their tariffs too. So maybe everyone ends up with lower tariffs, which is good for trade. It's like a nudge in the right direction, but they're still showing they're serious about getting a fairer deal.
Right. But is that a common approach, this half-rate thing?
I can't say I've seen it used a lot in trade negotiations. The idea of reciprocity is common, like you lower your tariffs and I'll lower mine. But this specific way of doing it, it's not something you see every day.
Interesting. And what did Trump say to other world leaders? What was his message about all this?
He was pretty blunt. He basically said, get rid of your tariffs, get rid of all your barriers to trade, stop messing around with your currency to get an advantage, and buy American.
Wow. Straight to the point.
No kidding. So the big idea seems to be, let's have balanced trade, and let's focus on making things here in the U.S., not relying on imports so much.
So bringing manufacturing back home and shrinking the trade deficit, that's the goal, it sounds like.
Feels like it.
But what about the countries the administration sees as the worst offenders, like the EU and China? How do these new tariffs fit into that?
Well, the White House sees these higher tariffs on those countries as a way to push back. They think those countries have been doing things that hurt the U.S. economy for a long time.
And they've had enough, basically.
Yeah, pretty much. And with these new tariffs, on top of the ones that were already there, China's now facing an average tariff of 54% on stuff it sends to the U.S.
54%, that's huge.
It is, and the administration's hoping that this kind of pressure will finally make these big economies change the way they do trade to make things more fair for the U.S.
With tariffs this big, I'm not surprised there's been such a strong reaction from the rest of the world.
Not at all.
What are world leaders saying? What are they worried about?
There's a lot of anxiety, I'd say, about how all this could shake up the global economy. You know, the whole world's connected these days when it comes to trade, and people are worried about the ripple effects.
Yeah.
We've heard concerns from leaders in Norway, Switzerland, Sweden, Australia, Ireland, Poland, Denmark, Canada, and Italy. They're all worried about disruption to trade and what it could do to their own economies.
And it's not just general worry. Some countries are specifically worried about their own economies and jobs, right?
Absolutely. The Irish government, for example, has been very clear that they're focused on protecting Irish jobs and their economy, which is really tied in with global trade.
Makes sense.
And the Prime Minister of Canada said these tariffs could completely change the way international trade works. So they're thinking about the big picture, the long-term effects of this on how countries do business with each other.
Some world leaders have been pretty sharp in their criticism of these tariffs.
Yeah.
What are some of the things they've said?
They haven't been shy, that's for sure. The Australian Prime Minister said the tariffs are completely unwarranted and not the kind of thing you'd expect from a close ally.
Ouch.
Yeah, pretty strong words. The Prime Minister of Italy just straight up said it's the wrong move. And I think the strongest condemnation came from the European Parliament, who officially called the tariffs unjustified, illegal, and disproportionate.
That's pretty serious.
It is. They're basically saying the U.S. is breaking international trade rules. So there's some real disagreement here, not just about whether it's a good idea, but whether it's even legal.
And it seems very likely that other countries will retaliate, right? Put their own tariffs on U.S. goods.
It's definitely on the table.
Yeah.
We've heard threats or strong hints about retaliation from China, the EU, Japan, South Korea, Colombia, and Mexico.
So pretty much everybody.
It's a pretty big group, yeah.
So,
And Canada was apparently getting ready with their own list of retaliatory tariffs, too. So this could easily escalate.
now, I heard that Australia is not going to retaliate. Why is that?
Yeah, it's interesting. Their prime minister said they don't want to do that because they think it'll just hurt their own consumers.
How so?
Well, they figure the U.S. tariffs are already going to make things more expensive for Americans, and they don't want to make things even worse by adding their own tariffs on top of that.
Oh, I see.
They're trying to avoid making things worse for everyone.
I also heard about a pretty direct response from the Premier of Ontario in Canada.
Oh, yeah, that was something. You know how Trump called this Liberation Day?
Yeah.
Well, the Premier of Ontario said that for them, the day these tariffs start is going to be Termination Day.
Wow.
It shows how strongly they feel about this, and they're already bracing for some negative consequences for businesses and trade.
So it's not all sunshine and roses.
Not exactly.
Let's talk about what could happen here in the U.S. because of all this.
Yeah.
What are businesses and economists saying?
There are a lot of concerns for sure. The Business Roundtable, which is a group of CEOs from some of the biggest companies in the U.S., they've come out and said these tariffs could really hurt American manufacturers.
How so?
Well, a lot of American manufacturers rely on parts and materials from other countries. So if those things get more expensive because of tariffs, it hurts their bottom line.
Right. Yeah.
And they're also worried about American workers, especially those whose jobs depend on international trade. If trade slows down, those jobs could be at risk.
That makes sense.
And of course, they're thinking about American families, too. If prices go up because of these tariffs, it's going to hit families in the wallet. And lastly, they're worried about American companies that export goods. If other countries retaliate with their own tariffs, those companies could lose business.
So they're seeing a real risk of a trade war where everyone loses.
That's their big concern, yeah.
And it's not just business leaders who are worried. What are financial experts saying about the bigger picture, the impact on the whole U.S. economy?
Fitch Ratings, which is a big credit rating agency, they've said these tariffs could push the average U.S. tariff rate up to 22%.
22%.
Yeah, that's the highest it's been since 1910. And they're comparing it to the time of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act.
What was that?
Well, that was back in the Great Depression, and a lot of economists think those tariffs actually made things worse.
Oh,
So it's not a great comparison to be making.
no, not at all.
Yeah.
And how do U.S. tariffs compare to other industrialized countries?
Well, an economist named Justin Wolfers did some analysis, and he thinks these tariffs could make the U.S. have the highest tariffs of any industrialized country.
Really?
Yeah, by a lot. And that's a big change because the U.S. has usually been a big advocate for free trade, for lowering tariffs around the world.
That's a big shift. So it sounds like a lot of experts are pushing back against this idea that other countries will just pay the cost of these tariffs.
Yeah, that's not how most economists see it. They think American businesses and American shoppers will be the ones who end up paying in the form of higher prices.
I see.
Like the National Retail Federation, they've been pretty loud about this. They say tariffs are like a tax on companies that import goods, and those companies are just going to pass those costs along to their customers.
So what kinds of things could get more expensive because of these tariffs?
Lots of things, potentially. Clothes, wine from Europe, bicycles, toys, some food items.
Wow, that's a lot of stuff.
Yeah, basically anything that has parts from other countries or is made entirely overseas could get more expensive.
What about housing? Could that be affected?
It could, because things like lumber, aluminum, and steel, those are all used in building houses. And if tariffs make those materials more expensive, it's going to cost more to build a house.
Right, which means new houses could get more expensive, right?
Exactly. And that's not good news when so many people are already struggling to afford housing.
Not good at all.
Yeah.
And what about cars? I know there's a big tariff on foreign cars.
Yeah, that one's likely to have a big impact. Some estimates say that 25% tariff could add anywhere from $5,000 to $20,000 to the price of a foreign car. And even cars made in the U.S., if they use parts from other countries, those could get more expensive too. So it's going to hit just about everyone who's thinking about buying a new car.
So the big worry is that these tariffs are going to make things more expensive for everyone, leading to higher inflation.
That's the main concern, yeah. And if things get more expensive, people might buy less stuff, which could slow down the whole economy.
Right, it's all connected. Are there any industries that are particularly worried about these tariffs?
Yeah, a few have been pretty vocal. The liquor and wine industries, they're not happy about this at all. They want to go back to having no tariffs on those products so trade can flow freely.
Okay.
And brewers in Canada are worried about the cost of ingredients and materials going up because of tariffs. And here in the U.S., in North Carolina, brewers and farmers are worried about the same thing, about higher costs for things like fertilizer, animal feed, and tools.
So it's a global issue.
It really is. And, all these tariffs, they could really mess with global supply chains.
What does that mean?
Well, companies all over the world depend on each other to make things. Like, a company in the U.S. might get parts from China, then send those parts to Mexico for assembly, and then sell the finished product in Europe.
Wow, that's complicated.
It is, and tariffs can make it a lot harder and more expensive for companies to do all that.
Right, because every step of the way they might have to pay more because of tariffs.
Exactly. And that's especially worrying for industries like pharmaceuticals, where the supply chain is really complex and delicate.
I see.
And we can't forget about small and medium-sized businesses, the smaller companies.
Right.
They often have a harder time dealing with stuff like this. They might not have the same buying power as big companies, so they can't negotiate better prices. And they often don't have a lot of extra cash on hand to absorb these kinds of costs.
So they're more vulnerable.
Definitely.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit and talk about how people here in the U.S. are reacting to all this,
Yeah.
politically and in the markets.
All right.
It seems like there are a lot of different opinions.
There are, yeah. In the Senate, there was a vote where some Republicans actually joined Democrats in saying they don't like Trump's tariff policy, especially when it comes to Canada. It was mostly symbolic, but it shows that not everyone in his own party is on board with this.
Interesting. But there are Republicans who support the tariffs, right?
Yeah, definitely. The Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, he's been pretty clear that he supports the tariffs.
What's his thinking?
Well, he thinks that putting this pressure on other countries will force them to lower their tariffs on U.S. goods, which would make things fairer.
Okay.
And other Republicans have had different reactions. Some are totally behind Trump's approach, while others are a little more cautious. They're worried about the risks, but they still agree with the goal of making trade fairer. Senator McConnell, he's actually been critical of tariffs in the past.
Yeah, he has. So there's a range of views within the Republican Party.
For sure.
What about the stock market? How have investors reacted to all this?
Well, when the news about the tariffs came out, the stock market didn't like it. Stock futures went down, which means investors are worried about what this could mean for companies' profits and the economy as a whole.
I see.
And companies that do a lot of business internationally, tech companies and retailers, those were the ones that got hit hardest in after-hours trading. They're the ones who are most exposed to these kinds of global trade issues.
So the market's initial reaction has been pretty negative.
Yeah, that's fair to say. And a lot of economists are predicting that these tariffs will lead to higher inflation in the U.S.
Right, because if things cost more to import, prices go up.
Exactly. And they're also worried that it could slow down economic growth because businesses will have to pay more for things and so will consumers, and there's always the chance of retaliation, which could hurt American companies trying to sell their goods overseas.
Yeah, that's a lot to worry about.
It is. And there was a recent poll by Marquette Law School that showed most Americans think tariffs are bad for the U.S. economy and will lead to higher prices.
So it seems like the public's not really on board with this either.
That's what the poll suggests, yeah.
Let's talk a little more about Canada, since they've come up a lot. There's this whole thing about their dairy supply management system, right?
Yeah, that's a big part of the trade relationship.
And Trump keeps talking about their high tariffs on dairy.
Right. And those tariffs are high, no question. But here's the thing. The U.S. isn't even sending Canada as much dairy as they're allowed to under the current trade deal without those high tariffs kicking in.
Really?
Yeah, so those super high tariffs that Trump keeps talking about, they're not actually the main problem right now.
Oh, I see.
It's more complicated than that.
It always is, isn't it? And what's Canada saying about all this?
Their finance minister has said they're going to respond strongly to these tariffs, and they've made it clear that they're going to defend their dairy system.
No surprise there.
And one of the co-founders of a Canadian brewery was talking about how these tariffs could make it a lot more expensive to make beer because they have to import some of their materials.
Ouch, that's not good for beer lovers.
Not at all. And we already mentioned that the Canadian Senate voted to undo that national emergency declaration that was used to justify some earlier tariffs on their goods.
Right, right. So they're not backing down.
Nope.
What about Northern Ireland? They're in a kind of unique situation because of that Windsor Framework Agreement, right?
Yeah, they are. They could actually end up getting hit with retaliatory tariffs from the EU, even if the UK as a whole doesn't retaliate.
How's that?
Well, because of the Windsor Framework, anything that goes into Northern Ireland has to follow EU rules. So if the EU decides to put tariffs on US goods, those tariffs could apply in Northern Ireland too, even if the rest of the UK doesn't have them.
Oh, wow, that's tricky.
Yeah, it could create some real complications.
Finally, what about Mexico? What are they planning to do about these tariffs?
Mexico's president, Sheinbaum, she said she's going to announce a big economic plan in response to all this. But from what she's said so far, it sounds like they're going to focus on making their own economy stronger, especially their car industry.
Okay.
So not necessarily immediate retaliation, but more like, we're going to deal with this by being strong ourselves.
Interesting. So it seems like these tariffs that Trump announced, they're a really big deal.
Oh, yeah, no question. They're shaking things up in the world of global trade, and there are a lot of potential problems that could come out of it.
We've covered a lot today. The details of the tariffs, the pushback from around the world, the threat of retaliation, and all the worries about what could happen to the U.S. economy, from higher prices to disruptions in all kinds of industries.
It's a lot to take in, that's for sure.
Hopefully all this has given our listeners a better understanding of what's going on.
I hope so, too. It's a complex situation with some potentially long-lasting effects on the global economy.
And it raises a big question.
It does.
Given everything we've heard, all the different opinions and reactions, what do you think, listeners? What do you think is going to be the biggest, most lasting impact of these tariffs on how countries trade and do business with each other in the future? Something to really think about.